On the 24th of February 2022, Russian soldiers invaded Ukraine, kickstarting a war that to date, around 2 weeks later, is still raging heavily. Now, the Ukrainian army fought back, and much more effectively and with much more spirit than the Russian army had anticipated. The Ukrainian army itself is made up of around 170,000 troops at the start of the invasion, as well as around 100,000 territorial defense forces and reserves. And since that time, around 143,000 Ukrainians have returned from abroad to enlist in their armed forces to fight against the Russian invasion. However, when compared to the Russian army numbering around 280,000 just in its ground forces section alone, this left a lot to be desired. And that's why on the 27th of February 2022, the government of Ukraine announced the creation of the Nationalne Legion Territorialnoye Oborone Ukrainie, or in English, the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine, commonly simply called the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, with the goal of enlisting sympathetic foreigners into the Ukrainian armed forces to fight against the Russians. And in today's video, I'll be looking at this Foreign Legion, who is joining it, from where and how many will be coming, what is the legal ramification for this, and could this actually stoke tensions between their countries of origin and Russia, and are there any historical parallels? All this and more in today's video. A quick note before starting is that half of the proceeds generated from advertisements on this video will be going to humanitarian charities that are helping people inside Ukraine as well as those that have fled the conflict. This isn't buying weapons or munitions, but this is buying first aid equipment and training, as well as food, shelter, clothing, and other essential goods that the people in Ukraine need now that they've had a war thrust upon them. There will also be links in the description below so that those who are interested can check out the charities that I'll be giving to, and if they want, can also give something themselves. Now, the Ukrainian government decided to create a foreign legion so that foreigners could come and fight in its armed forces against the Russian invasion. They created a website on which people could easily see how to apply to this foreign legion inside their own countries. This proved to be a very effective call to arms, as on the 3rd of March, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, announced that around 16,000 volunteers had signed up to go and fight in Ukraine from abroad. But at the time of filming this, several days later, on the 7th of March, it had been announced that around 20,000 are likely to have joined, the figure possibly being higher still at this point. It's also claimed that these volunteers hail from 52 different countries around the world, although many of them probably come from the countries with the largest Ukrainian diaspora, as these will often have Ukrainian family members back in the old country who would then want to go back and fight, as well as more of a connection with Ukraine. Now, actually, the country with the largest diaspora is Russia itself, and it's hard to verify if many from Russia have either wanted to or been able to go into Ukraine to join their Ukrainians. But outside of Russia, Canada, Poland, the United States, Brazil, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Argentina, Germany, Italy, France, and Belarus all have, in that order, the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world. And so many of the recruits have actually come from these countries to go back to Ukraine to fight. There's also a rather large Ukrainian diaspora in Israel, and we know that quite a few have come back from Israel, as Ukraine had a very large Jewish population and still has one of the largest Jewish populations on earth. Following the Second World War, some 400,000 Ukrainian Jews escaped to Israel and live there along with their descendants to this day. And in Ukraine itself, as I mentioned, there are around 40,000 practicing Jews, with many more people with Jewish ancestry as well, meaning that many Jews living in Israel with Ukrainian descent have Jewish family over in Ukraine, as well as Ukrainian heritage. And we do indeed know that there are quite a few Israelis who are going back over to Ukraine to join this foreign legion. It's also true that the state of Israel has another connection with Ukraine, as Israel is often seen as the protector of Jews internationally, and of course the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, is himself one of only, I believe, 4 Jewish presidents in the world. It's been very difficult to ascertain exact figures, particularly from particular countries, as to foreign volunteers for this legion, because a lot of the countries don't want to announce how many there are. The Ukrainian government has given some large figures which are very difficult to verify, and so the next list that I've compiled is simply a list of figures that I have seen quoted somewhere. Many of them will likely be inaccurate, but this is just to give an idea of figures that I have seen quoted, but of course have not been able to verify. And so we can see multiple different countries, some in North America like the United States and Canada, some even in East Asia such as South Korea and Japan, others in South America like Brazil, where we know a lot of people have Ukrainian heritage, as well as Colombia, which of course has a rich mercenary culture to say the least. So these are the types of countries and the rough, potentially the amounts of people that are going over to join the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. The case of Japan is rather interesting because Japan doesn't have a large Ukrainian diaspora. However, it becomes more obvious why people may wish to enlist to fight who are from Japan, because Japan is a famously pacifist country following the Second World War, and indeed its armed forces, or the self-defense forces, are unable to deploy in other countries because of the very strict laws of pacifism in the country. And so we know that around 70 Japanese people have gone over to join the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, 50 of whom were members of the self-defense forces, obviously well-trained military troops which can be put to good use by the Ukrainians, and which indeed are likely to be used training other soldiers, many of those who have just joined Ukrainian militias. A similar story with South Korea, although of course South Korea does have an existential threat, which is its northern neighbor, and the South Korean government was rather ambiguous about whether its troops would be allowed to join the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, although of course in South Korea there is still conscription and mandated military service because of the threat of the North Koreans. At the same time, however, the Korean government has also said it wouldn't be prosecuting those volunteers that did go over to fight who had done their military service in South Korea. And of course, those who have done military service, and especially ex-servicemen, are exactly the kinds of people that the Ukrainian government had in mind who they would like to join their foreign legion. And it's been announced that there have been dozens of these soldiers from South Korea going to Ukraine, and that the Ukrainian government has sent them immediately to join the combat on the front lines and indeed to help with training. Israel also proved to be a fertile hunting ground for the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, as many in Israel have either Ukrainian or Russian, Belarusian or other former USSR roots, and these are indeed the kinds of people joining up. Now, especially useful for the Ukrainian army is the fact that most of these will have served in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and so will have combat experience and training, which of course is very useful when sending people off to war. A lot of the volunteers from Western countries that have signed up are also ex-military. Of course, it's a lot more difficult for those currently serving in the military to go and fight, although the French Foreign Legion did make a special exception for Ukrainian members that they would be allowed to go and to fight in Ukraine without officially being labelled as deserters. And it's not only those of a military background or those on the ground that are going to fight in the Legion. There are also, of course, many in intelligence, as well as with other skills such as firefighting and also medical skills that are very useful on the battlefield, who have gone forward to fight. But there are also those who have gone who have no such experience whatsoever. Many idealists who simply want to go and do their bit. Whether or not that will be helpful will remain to be seen. Foreign volunteers have actually been going to fight in Ukraine since 2014, as Ukraine fought against two rebel regions in the east of the country, with volunteers being split almost 50-50, some joining the Ukrainian side and some joining the rebel pro-separatist Russian side. side to fight for the Donetsk People's Republic or the Lugansk People's Republic. And actually, as I talked about in another video, Chechens have also been fighting in Ukraine on both sides of the conflict, and indeed now also as part of the Russian forces since 2014. But how have different countries reacted to the announcement for a foreign legion? Well, just as there's been a diverse array of countries from which these volunteers have come, there has been an equally diverse array of official responses from different governments. On the 3rd of March, the Russian government officially responded. Of course, they aren't happy about having troops being sent from abroad to go and fight against them. And they stated that if they captured such members of this foreign legion, they would not be afforded prisoner of war status and may not actually be treated humanely, given the fact that they would essentially be acting as mercenaries, depending on how one interprets that. Something which perhaps is a little bit hypocritical on the Russian side, given their extensive use of mercenaries in the past and undoubtedly also in this conflict against Ukraine. Other countries, key NATO members such as the United Kingdom, the United States, the Netherlands and Germany have all said that it would in fact be legal. Some in the United Kingdom have actually encouraged people to go and said that they would afford them any help, while the official line from the Prime Minister and indeed just today of military figures was that they asked those not to go over because actually that could be a real key for Russian propaganda to say that the West is actively fighting against them. Likewise, in the Netherlands, it was said that it would in fact be legal because in Dutch law, it's only illegal to join a force if it is at war with the Netherlands, which the Ukraine is not, and it's also not a terrorist organization. But at the same time, the Dutch government recommended against going and fighting in Ukraine, given the situation there. Two Central European countries, Poland and the Czech Republic, have both announced that it would be legal for countrymen of theirs to go and join this foreign legion, but they needed to seek prior permission either from the direct government, the president, or from the military establishments within that country. On the other hand, there are also some countries like Australia, Slovakia, Denmark, Singapore and Senegal, which have all said something along the lines of it would not in fact be legal within our system of law for someone from our country to go over and to fight against Russia in Ukraine. Singapore has said that those Singaporeans should not get involved in any conflict, no matter how noble, if it wasn't directly involving Singapore. While the Danish government simply said that they didn't believe within their law it would be legal. Something similar said by the Australian government, and the government of Senegal as well as I believe Algeria have both criticised the Ukrainian government for putting out their post to invite foreigners over to fight. And what's interesting is that we do actually know that several people from Senegal in Africa have gone over to Ukraine to join this foreign legion. There is a fear that should citizens of other countries be captured fighting for the Ukrainians in Ukraine against the Russians, then the Russians may see this as other countries becoming involved in the war, which could escalate tensions further, as the Russians have previously stated that any attempt to get involved in Ukraine by another nation would be seen as an admission of war and would likely drag them into a conflict. And with Russia's nuclear weapons on high alert, that's not something a lot of nations are willing to risk right now. There has also been quite a lot of criticism, particularly about how certain Western countries have responded to the call to arms and by saying it would be legal and even encouraging those to go, as this is a very different response to when many would be going to fight in Syria when the civil war broke out there in 2011. Even those who would be going to fight with, say, the Kurdish forces against the Islamic State, who received a lot of criticism and also would often be prosecuted when they came back from the Middle East. Many say this is in fact a double standard and argued the government may be creating a worse evil than they realized. An interesting historical comparison can be made with the Spanish Civil War, during which time international brigades were called up and fought on the Republican side for 3 years. I made a video about this way back in 2017, so if you can do deal with my high-pitched, sort of vaguely pubescent voice, then please do go and check that video out if you're interested. Now, the conflict started in 1936, and many volunteers from many countries around the world came and fought alongside the Republicans, many of them ideologically driven. And it's actually more relevant than you might think, because even in Canada today, the relevant legislature that determines whether people can go out and fight was actually drafted as a result of Canadians going and joining the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War. There's also something interesting, which is the shift in government attitudes because of the international brigades and how people going out and fighting for various governments was seen. For example, in the Netherlands, if one went and fought for a foreign military, one lost one's Dutch citizenship. And this was a great problem because many Dutchmen who went over and served in the international brigades returned to the Netherlands following the defeat of the Republicans in 1939, and of course the following year the Germans invaded the Netherlands. And as a result of this, all of them who had gone over and fought for the Republicans no longer had any valid identification documents, and so they were shipped off, many of them to labor camps where they were killed by the Germans, and only some of them survived the war. Back then there were also many fears because most of those who went over in the international brigades were either communists, socialists or anarchists, as these were the ones organizing the development of the international brigades during the conflict. And there were worries that when they came back to their countries of origin, they might also start with revolutionary ideas or trying to overthrow their own governments now that they had combat experience. And actually some voices are coming up now and saying, do we really want people to be going over to Ukraine to be getting military experience themselves? As in the past, there were a lot that went who were very much on the far right or the neo-Nazi end of the political spectrum, joining groups like Azov and others. Now, many of these were actually stopped even at the airport, and increasingly so in the run-up to this invasion. Now, of course, there is a proper war, but does that change the fact that there are far-right battalions fighting on that front, and that people from Western countries and others around the world are joining and are learning to use weapons and explosives, who might then come back and use them in their own countries? This is a problem for many governments, as many actively wish to support Ukraine, but perhaps don't want to enable everyone who wants to go out and shoot a gun in a war zone to do so. So it's a difficult question for many governments how exactly to respond to this. And I think that's why we've seen this elaborate spectrum of responses, some being rather ambiguous like Korea, some being more in favor like Canada, and others outright saying that its citizens should not go to Ukraine and criticizing the Ukrainian government for having done so. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think about this announcement? Do you think that many people will go forward, and do you think they will actually end up being very effective at all? Let me know, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this issue, as that is the end of this video. Now, of course, it's still very early days, and I do apologize for the fact that I wasn't able to give you very exact figures on different people coming from different countries, because this story is still very much developing at the time that I'm recording it. Now, if you would like to see another video on something similar in the future, then do let me know. I did have the idea of maybe looking at the Georgian Legion, which is a similar volunteer battalion or legion made up of those coming from Georgia, who have fought in the Ukrainian conflict since 2014 and continue to fight today, as well as one that's come from northern Belarus, who are trying themselves to overthrow their own government, the Lukashenko-Putin-aligned government that is currently in power in Belarus. If you'd be interested in that kind of thing, then do let me know in the comments below, and I will do my best to cover that in the future. Have a look at the charities in the description below, because it would really be great if you can help out in any way to help out those who are really in a tough situation at the minute. But until next time, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.